Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, and welcome to another chapter of Turn the Page, the official podcast of Syosset Public Library. I'm Jenn, your co-host for today, and I'm here today with the author of a really exciting new book that really blew me away, and I can't wait to talk about it. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Sure. Hi, Jenn. I'm Lily Brooks Dalton, and I'm here to talk about The Light Pirate, which is my new book.
Thank you so much for coming. Could you tell me a little bit about this is a big question, but about your writing career and kind of how it led you to this book? Like, what are your interests? What are the topics that have, caught your fancy as you've written, and how did it lead you into The Light Pirate?
Sure. So this is my third book. My first book was actually a memoir called Motorcycles I've Loved. And I never, I didn't really set out to write to write nonfiction. Fiction had always been my main interest, but I was writing these essays, and someone suggested to me that they could be a book. And so that's kind of how the first one came about. And then from there, I wrote Good Morning Midnight, which is my first novel and my second book. And that one was, my first venture into fiction, also into sci-fi. And I think, there are a lot of ways in which that book and this one are really interested in loneliness versus solitude. They're both really interested in the landscape as a character unto itself. And I've kind of recently been thinking about how in my work, I'm really interested in letting mysteries stay mysterious, not wanting to answer every question. Sort of like the beauty of a thread that is left dangling a little bit, even though I I definitely have heard from readers who don't love that as much, or just really want to have all the answers and to know what happens to everyone, and to just tie everything off. But I don't know, to me, leaving to me, it's a matter of, I think of it as negative space, right? Like negative space in visual art, what you can learn by noticing what's not there. So those are just I guess a few of the through lines in my work, but yeah.
I love that. That is so interesting to me. And I really particularly like the idea that you let the mysteries stay mysterious, because that's always been something that I really loved in storytelling, when you don't get all the answers at the end, for two reasons. Because one, that's often what life is like, we rarely get explanations for why things happen to us, that satisfy us. But two, those are the stories that tend to stay with me more, kind of the way that um, getting all the answers sort of puts a bow on everything and closes it up, gives you closure. And then you can move on to talk about other things. But when you don't get those answers, it really lingers. And I think that's a really cool and interesting storytelling choice.
Yeah, I totally agree on both counts. I mean, on the first one, I think you're so right. I've actually said that before, it's how life works, is we don't get all the answers, and it's such an intrinsic part of being a human being and being alive, and learning how to exist within that uncertainty and work with it. And then secondly, I think there's a way in which leaving space to invite a reader into the work to come to their own conclusions, to imagine their own outcomes. I don't know. I think there's just something really special for me as a reader when I find a book that is making space for my imagination alongside the author's. Because, you know, a novel is such a collaborative experience, like between reader and writer. It's not like a film where you are kind of given all the senses, well, not all of them, but there's like a little less room, you know, to come in and bring your own ideas to it. But it's something really special about books, I think.
Oh, absolutely. That's a really interesting distinction to make because I'm also a fan of film, but like, yeah, books invite you to participate more. Like you have to do a little bit more work to get immersed in them. Um, and that is something that I found very easy to do with this book, actually. Like, imagining myself in this opening scene of this horrifying hurricane. You know, it's rendered so evocatively, and it's really easy to understand the fear that would come, like not only with going through something like that in the moment, but just the general fear of living in you know, I think you term it like the cone of uncertainty in the book, like in this area that is vulnerable to hurricanes. And you know, it felt very real while I was reading it because like I have my sister and my nieces live in Florida, outside Orlando, and so like there's a hurricane passing through there right now, and I'm, you know,
Yeah.
yeah, and I was like, wow, this is all very real. um, but could you talk a little bit about this opening scene and whether I'm curious about like whether this storm was your inception point, like your way into the story? Like, did the storm, the event come first and then the aftermath follow? Or did you imagine the world that the hurricane produced first, if that makes any sense?
No, that makes complete sense. I'm not sure I remember which, like what came first. I know that, um, you know, my parents live in Florida and I didn't grow up there, but it's been my kind of home base for my whole adult life. And I had been spending a little more time there than I usually do. I had was working at two different writing residencies that both happened to be in Florida. And when I was in Key West at the studios of Key West, there was a hurricane coming through, and there was something about that sort of um, ritual of preparing, um, and just like how seamlessly, like everyone knew what to do, um, and just watching that community, you know, rise to the uncertainty, to the challenge of this coming storm really stirred up something for me. So that's definitely, I think, probably the beginning of the book. But I always knew that I wanted to move beyond the world, the timeline that we're in, like the world as we know it. I wanted to link the two together. Like that was always kind of part of the conceit for the book, is wanting to begin in a time that feels nowish. And honestly, I started writing this book in 2016, which since then we've had Hurricane Maria, we just had Ian. Like what at the time felt to me like tomorrow is now feels like today.
Yeah.
So I wanted to begin there and then just like push out into this sort of unknown future and bring in some I guess some sci-fi elements. There's like a little thread of magical realism as well, but I wanted to make sure that everything felt grounded and possible.
Mm.
um, so yeah, that's kind of where it started.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I am particularly interested in the way that this book relates to genre because you know, it touches on many, like some of the ones that you've just discussed and more, while, you know, at the same time kind of resisting categorization. And I'm wondering if there were you know, if conceptualizing these genres helped you pick the path that the story would go, you know, or if like you wanted to subvert genre expectations. Like what was your relationship to genre here?
I love that question. It's funny. I think in the book that I'm working on right now, I'm thinking so much more about genre in a conscious way. I think with the Light Pirate, I was kind of just like, so there are a few sections in the book. So it's organized by power, which is the section that's dealing with hurricanes and like, these powerful storms. And then it moves into water, and then light, and then time. And so I was really using that structure to guide the pacing of the book and also the shape of each of those sections. Like, so I wanted power to feel really fast and sudden and kind of shocking, which it sounds like a thriller,
Yeah.
but it wasn't totally on my mind that I was like, okay, part one is going to be like a thriller, and then part two, it was more kind of conceiving of these elemental structures and trying to make the writing match those and just like, yeah, move within that framework.
Mm, that's really cool because like each section almost works as a novella, as well as like as a piece of this broader narrative. And I think it's just like so artfully structured.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I in terms of the more fantastical elements, I think that is something that I've always loved to play with and that I'm really interested in playing with. But there's also this very, I don't know, I feel like there's this anchor inside of my creative self that's like, it has to be believable though. Like it has to be adhered to a certain amount of reality, which I think is, I don't know what that says about me as a person, but like, um, it's been interesting throughout, these different books to try and like pull away, like see how far that rope goes, like how far we can wander away from that anchor. So that was definitely something I was conscious of in this book, is like wanting this feeling of magic to be inside of it, in a subtle way, but to be really kind of, I don't know. I mean, I think because I was so drawn to using Florida as a real character in the book, there is something intrinsically magical to me about landscape and like the world we live in. Just
Mm.
not really a fresh take, but like I wanted that feeling to be in the book.
Mm. Yeah, that makes total sense to me. And I think that one of the things that I thought a lot about while reading this is that balance between realism and magic and how you navigate it while also, keeping the reader grounded in the story, but allowing yourself to play with these different elements. Wanda in particular, the character who is born at the inception of the story and whose life the story traces, has a really rich internal world, and she has really interesting and complex relationships with her family members and the people that she kind of finds along the way as she's like navigating this world. And so I guess what I was really trying to get at is, does Wanda's emotional journey speak to the world building and the development of the story, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think that's part of the fun of pulling in a landscape in this way, where you're kind of giving it, I mean, it's alive without my help, but like giving it a little more life, so to speak, is that it then does adhere to the characters and to those arcs in this kind of this specific way, where a main character has to grow right across the course of a story, or change in some way,
Mhm.
and in making a landscape a main character, it too must change. And so I think in this book there's a very physical and like tangible way in which that's happening, but also
Mhm.
yeah, it was uh definitely on my mind, wanting to just like give a hint of consciousness to that. that landscape as well, and a little bit of agency even. Yeah.
I asked a very opaque question, so
No, I loved it. I loved it. That's a really interesting train of thought.
um like that is one of the things that really spoke to me as I was reading, is the way that the environment plays a role in it. And I think that like we love to toss around the phrase like, oh, the city is a character in this, or like like the town is a character in this book. But oftentimes I think that could just mean like it determines like the mise en scène or like the mood of the piece or anything, but like you really imagine the environment to have like almost a will and a perspective in a lot of ways, and that decentering of the human, I guess, or at least making the environment as important as the human, is just like lends such an interesting perspective to the story here.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm thinking, it makes me think about I call them interludes. I don't know if that's the right word, but that's the word that always comes to mind for them, that pop up within each section that is literally kind of playing with that perspective of like, what is the perspective of this hurricane? What is the perspective of the rising sea level? Like and it was really hard to get those sections to a place that I felt good about, because I think there's this way in which it can just feel like too much and overly like too flowery, too over the top, just like but it was at this, so I really struggle with those, but at the same time I was like, it's really important to me that these are here. It's really kind of integral to what I'm trying to do, that we have this sense of a gaze that is so much larger and more varied and more omniscient than any human can really hold. Yeah,
it's really fascinating, and I'm very curious about like what your process was for giving voice to these various like elemental forces, or these like big concepts that structure our lives, like time, and like and something that you achieve very well is just sort of like conveying how such a different long perspective would make human lives take on such a different kind of like scale or relative I don't want to say importance, because lives are important obviously, but just like uh the amount of space I guess they take up, sort of like on this grand scale of space time that structures like the environment a lot more than our lives. So when you were structuring the story around Wanda, and I would love to talk about her a little bit more because she's so fascinating, imagining Wanda and both, sort of the forces and the things around her as like actors in this story, what sort of perspective do you think this lends you on like our world, um, that differ from like, so I think that when you tell stories at a human scale, it's very easy to fall into stories of like, progress and achievement and these sort of very structured like hero's journey type stories. But you really challenge us to take like a longer view on stories that really, I think, change the way that you look at like human achievement and what it has meant for the world. So I guess what I'm getting at is like, what do you think, like including the environment and its perspective, like what do you think that has to offer us as people like learning to live within this world that is like changing because of our actions,
totally. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that kind of brings me back to when I first started conceiving of the book and the clock of it, and knowing that I wanted to use a single human lifetime as the kind of boundaries of the book. And part of the reason I wanted to do that, I mean, the book is about many things, but one of them is climate change and the climate catastrophe that we find ourselves in. And I think something that has really like made it difficult for us as a culture to engage with this problem is our relationship to time. And our inability to really truly look beyond our own lifetime. And because of that, we find ourselves in the situation that we're in today, in which these things are occurring within our lifetime, and so I wanted to chart that transition between this sort of ambiguous anxiety that I think many, if not all of us, are experiencing in terms of the climate and what's happening to the land we live on, into like these projections that right now we're experiencing as academic papers and really terrifying headlines, and this sort of these projections into a future that we are starting to imagine and be really frightened by, but have not encountered yet. And so, let me try and bring this back around to, so I think in terms of using these perspectives and the scale of the timeline in the book as a way to try and open up a reader's perspective on what this is so tricky to talk about because for all the obvious reasons, but like I think this is part of my inability to articulate what I want to say is in fact like what the point is within the book is like, how can we even have productive conversations about this without veering into sort of just like gloom, and which is not to say that's not important. It's like, feel your feelings, but like there's a point at which conversations about climate change and the climate crisis feel unhelpful. They feel futile, or they feel like they're not leading anywhere. We're just like on this hamster wheel of anxiety about this problem that we cannot even conceive of solving. And it becomes easier to just talk about something else. And to kind of like set it on the shelf and address the problem of your day, like, what are you going to have for lunch? Did you get in a fight with your partner? Like that kind of. So those two scales, I think we're living with those polarities right now, all the time. And I think there's this cognitive dissonance that we all feel when those are, necessarily bouncing up against each other in our daily lives, of just like where to point our attention. It's making me think of, needing glasses and the difference between being short-sighted or nearsighted and farsighted, and just like, I guess we all just need a pair of bifocals. I don't know.
Because we are sort of like the whole climate question, and I think this is what makes, the way that you just explained it makes me feel so much better about the inarticulateness of my own questions. Because I'm like, it is hard to talk about this because like we're trying to get outside of our human perspective, and we're humans, and that's really hard. But it speaks to how big a challenge the messaging is too, because on the one hand, you want to be realistic and convey the urgency in a way that will like perhaps spur people to action. But on the other hand, you don't want to make it sound so dire and so fatalistic that it moves people to not do anything because they think that the cause is helpless, you know? And so getting that conveying the urgency while also not overwhelming um our ability to sort of like grapple with the problem is immensely difficult. And there's something about like experiencing what climate can do to a place over the course of one human life that it conveys the awe and the magnitude of it, but it also makes it like just a little bit more digestible, which I think is something like really admirable and stunning that this book does.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a liberty that the book takes, in that I don't think it's realistic that this will happen over a single lifetime. If someone was born today, that this is where things would end up. But I don't know, maybe like crazy stuff happens all the time. Like, I think that has really been an experience that we've all shared the past couple of years, of just like seeing these happenings around the world coming down the pike and showing up in our news feeds, and just having to really quickly adjust to this thing that we felt we either didn't think about at all, or if we did, felt was so unlikely that it wasn't even really on the radar of possibility. And then suddenly it's arrived and we're adjusting to it. So yeah, it's been really strange to be working on this book and over the past few years. Yeah, it's been odd.
I can't imagine. Yeah, I mean, there's it's really really fascinating that like in a way history could almost like outpace the creative process, because like you were writing the situation like as we're seeing it unfolding, and it's just like very timely, but it also feels like it speaks to the future in a very important way. And I think like what's really important about it too is that it does, I guess, like relating to the messaging issue I was talking about, that it is very honest and it's very unwavering in its depiction of like how hard human life would be under those conditions, but it is also like hopeful, and like it does sort of like make you marvel at the human spirit, and how adaptable individuals and communities can be. And I wanted to ask about Florida too, because I think like that, um, like Florida is the butt of so many jokes, and it's very easy to sort of, I think, look at it very cynically, especially from our vantage point. But this is a very loving portrait of Florida, like even though as it acknowledges like some of the like the challenges, and I'm wondering about like how your time in Florida in these writing residences, how that inflected your perspective on Florida and how it showed up in your story.
Yes, I love that you brought this up, because Florida does occupy this really unkind place in our in our collective understanding, and I think it's really unfair. And well, I think so. My history with Florida, my relationship to Florida, kind of became much more personal to me when my parents decided to move there, when I was, I think, 20, 21, something around there. And, I had grown up in Vermont my whole life, and had this, really this relationship to snow and New England. And, you know, I was like, this is part of my identity. And so when they moved to Florida, I was kind of like, what? Why? Florida's dumb. Like, I don't like this. I don't like this at all. And sort of had that journey of maybe tagging on to that cultural understanding of what Florida is. You know, it's like the Florida man, it's Disney World, Disneyland, Disney World. I can never remember which one is which.
World, I think. Yeah.
I should know because I live in Los Angeles, but you know, this idea of poverty and drug addiction and spring break and all these extremes, and then spending so much more time there in my 20s, you know, because this is where my parents are now, and then spending even more time there during these writing residencies, I came to really appreciate the landscape. I mean, it's a stunning climate that is so varied. There's so many incredible plants there, animals, like it's so much more than, and it's cities too, which isn't to like discount its more populated areas. You know, the other, I mentioned the residency in Key West, and the other one was at the Kerouac House in Orlando. And Orlando is this city that I think is hard for most people to separate from whichever Disney that is. I think World, I think you're right. But it's its own city with its own like rich history and current culture. And so yeah, I've definitely been on my own little journey in terms of how I think about Florida. And the more time that I spent there, the more fascinating I found it, because it does hold so many polarities. I mean, just politically, obviously, economically, I think we're seeing this a lot in terms of the disasters that have hit Florida, you know, Hurricane Ian, like who can afford to rebuild and who can't. You know, I think Florida is also the one of many front lines of climate change. So there's so many things going on in this state. And it's so I don't know, I think it has become sort of this two-dimensional joke in other parts of the country, and I don't like that. And yeah, so I wanted to, I don't know if that's part of where the book came from. I think it was just spending time there, but the more that I worked on it, the more I felt like this matters to me, that there's like this portrait is nuanced and not kind of tagging on to that constant.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it really shows, you know, how in order to kind of like really understand a place, you have to really cultivate empathy, you know, like, because I think like one of the not so great parts of human nature is that we love like Schadenfreude, you know, and we love to like create situations in our heads where we imagine that like people are responsible for their suffering, you know, or like they've made decisions that like land them in the places that they are. And so it's so easy for people outside of Florida to be like, well, you know, like, yeah, look where they chose to live, look how they vote, look at any number of things, you know. And I think that like resisting that sort of like easy labeling creates a much more empathetic portrait for both its people and the land and the other non-human lives that occupy it, you know.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. I think yeah, if empathy isn't a central piece of a novel, then you know what's that, what is it doing?
Agreed. Well, I loved this book so much, and I'm wondering if you have any projects on the horizon that you're able to speak to. Like, are these issues, you know, are these issues that you're carrying forward with you into your future writing? Are you exploring new areas, or you know, what's going on?
Yeah, totally. Well, actually, I think in a lot of ways, The Light Pirate is a little bit of a companion to my previous novel, Good Morning Midnight, and just, I mean, they're very different, but I think they're both they're partners in kind of what they're getting at. And so moving forward, I wanted to do something different. I wanted to make a little bit of a departure. And it was also just so taxing to work on this book. It was so sad to spend so many years in this world, which is also a hopeful world. I think. But just like going there day after day was tough. So after this book, I was like, I want to write some fantasy. So that's what I'm working on now. Which is, and when I say fantasy, I don't know, I think people bring their own assumptions to that genre, but I'm working more with like this sort of absurd surrealist kind of fantasy, and it's been fun. I don't know how much I can really say about it more than that, but I really needed something a little bit more lighthearted, and again, to try and kind of see how far away I could get from that anchor of reality and really play with that constraint that I have been feeling over these past few books.
Well, that sounds really cool. And I would love, if when that project finally comes to our libraries and our bookstores, if you would come back and talk to us again, because I've enjoyed this conversation a lot. There's a lot of really hard to voice questions, and you did a really good job of answering them, even if they weren't always coherent. So thank you.
Oh, of course. Thank you, Jen. I would love to come back anytime. This was so much fun. It was a really perfect way to kick off this whole book press thing that we do.
Oh, thank you so much. Okay, listeners. So as of the day that you hear this, The Light Pirate will be available at your nearest bookstore or library. This has been Jen in conversation with Lily Brooks Dalton, and it is time to close this chapter. Bye-bye.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.